book are high. And that's why it's extensive, and that's why the notation is somewhat formidable. And I should know I have to write the bloody stuff, right? And there's more of it. And that's another thing. Many people will probably wonder that who sat down with me for an hour or two, why is there more about me? But that'll be natural. I mean, everything's in it. Every single case that resulted in conviction is in this book. And that will be the case with Volume 2 as well, regardless of where people came from or where they ended up. The point is that many of the stories are quite similar, and with a view to engaging a reader over a substantial text, I try to avoid repetition. Now, if something was particularly significant, I highlighted that. And that, of course, is my opinion. And other people will have opinions that I've missed the point here, I've overstated something, I've underestimated something. That has to be the case. And this is an organic thing. I'm certainly open for business in terms of constructive criticism and corrections. There will be a second volume, and insofar as it's practical or justifiable, if I think I need to sort of represent something, I will do so. And this, of course, is not the last word. As I said in Kilmainham, for those of you who were able to get in, which thankfully turned out to be most people, this is the start of something. There's no way one can ever start to write a definitive book. You aim high, and I aimed high, and I did the best I could in the time available. And there's a certain amount of time pressure, because no one wanted this thing to go on and on and on and on. There's some time when you just have to put something out as the first entry into a new area, because it is a new area. There's nothing substantial in it anywhere. Notwithstanding the very fine memoir written by the late Ray McLaughlin, this is a different type of book. It's an attempt to write a comprehensive history. But there will definitely be, I think, within my work to date, which I received significant assistance from the people who are named by Anne and by myself additionally, most of whom are acknowledged in this book, and those who have been omitted will be included in the next one. There is definitely scope for many more localised accounts. One could, for instance, write about the experiences of volunteers from one county area or one prison area. One could do an entire book, and I'm looking at him right now, the astounding story of Michael Gockin, of Frank Stagg, indeed of Noel Jenkinson, who was with the officials until shortly before his death. Many others who survived. I know, and you know them as well, in many cases, Belfast men who were moved 70 times. Now, whatever that does to an individual prisoner, can you imagine the additional stress that places on their family? I know people who were attacked and brutalised. And it is a very difficult thing for someone like myself, used to dealing with documents about people who will be dead for 150 years or 200 years, to suddenly sit in front of someone who's been traumatised. I can't pretend that was easy. But with my sort of personal view of what history should be, I was able to produce this text. Now, it is extensive. There's room for more. Many of you will be called upon perhaps in the future to assist insofar as you can, and I would welcome that help. I see, for instance, I see John McComb here at the front. John's been very helpful already. He'll be even more helpful in Volume 2, where he's going to be in it himself. Many of you will have to sort of bide your time. I would hope that this time in 2 years or thereabouts that this Volume 2 will be there, and Volume 3 won't take as long as that, because the work for it will be done in the interim. So I'm going to say no more about it. I'm resisting the temptation to keep talking, because there's so much I could cover. I'll end by saying I'm delighted to have to find myself in the presence of Garrett Pierce, who very graciously gave me a very insightful, typically insightful, and much more concise than I could ever be, overview when I met her in her offices in Camden. I'm delighted to see you here, and I'll hand you back to Anne. Thank you for coming.
As I said earlier, Garrett Pierce is one of the greatest campaigners for human rights in the world. She is a shining example to us all as someone who is not afraid to stand up for what is right. Garrett hates publicity and recognition, but I know that a lot of people in this room are eternally grateful to her, as she saw them through some of the darkest days of the prison struggle. She was always available to represent people who were being denied justice. It didn't matter what time of day it was or what day of the week it was, she was always available to represent prisoners, and still is to this day. And it's been a great honour for me to speak tonight, but it's an even greater honour to invite Garrett to the podium to say a few words.
Thank you very much for asking me to be here. I cannot tell you what a privilege it is. In fact, I was thinking I would say what a privilege it was, but then in my head I can hear Sister Sarah's voice in my head saying, but she doesn't deserve it. So, an apology for all the things that I didn't do. An apology to the people I represented who felt they had to escape because they had such a hopeless solicitor. And an apology to the people who marched off to 30 years or more imprisonment and didn't blame me for it. And also, sadly, remembering two people who you always think if they hadn't got off or hadn't had a shorter sentence, maybe they would be here today, Dermot O'Neill and Kevin Barry O'Donnell. It was an extraordinary thing to have this book tonight in the jail, and just to be in that jail and to think of all the people who have been there, who had fought and laid down their lives, and given their lives, just as all of you. They've given most of your lives for something incredibly important. And I cannot tell you how extraordinary it is to have had the honour to have met you. I cannot tell you how important it is, not just in my life, that's personal luck and privilege, but to be able to tell other people about what you've done, what you fought, how you fought, what you suffered. And there are many prisoners now in English jails, a different suspect community, Muslims, and they ask, was it like this for the Irish? They ask. It's not just one, it's again and again. They ask, was it like this? And is there any hope? And how did the Irish work through this? How did they? How did they get through it? How did men and women get through it who were facing all their lives in prison? How did they find the courage or the stoicism? And one of the things one says is actually they had it harder. And people don't easily believe if you say their families would travel all the way to the Isle of Wight or to Franklin and be told that the person they'd come to see had been moved. That doesn't happen now. Or solitary confinement. There was a report published last week by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture. And he said this is an international minimum norm. He said solitary confinement beyond 14 days constitutes torture, urging every country in the world to discontinue applying torture. There are men and women, mainly men, who spent year after year after year in solitary confinement, Republican prisoners, in brutal units designed to break the soul. And they survived. But with what damage? With what self-sacrifice? And one of the things that I tell prisoners now is that Republican prisoners fought for rights. They fought using whatever means there were. But in prisons, they fought to have their basic rights established, and because of that, prisoners now have rights different than they would have had when you all were there. The absolutely key cases establishing rights, Campbell and Fell, Sean Campbell and Father Fell, the right for prisoners to correspond, the right for prisoners to have lawyers come in. Roy Walsh, Billy Armstrong, Ronnie McCartney, they fought for the absolutely fundamental right to know if you had a life sentence, how long was the minimum length of time you had to serve before you could be released. All of those dry as dust procedural rules that weren't rules at all. It was like the Wild West in terms of rules for prisoners. But it was Republican prisoners who paved the way by fighting as individuals and collectively for that. And that's important. But there is so much more that we may be blind and deaf in England. We perhaps always have been and always will be. But there is now at least a dim understanding that people who fight don't fight blindly. They fight for a reason, and it has to be comprehended, and we have to talk. And the concept not just that there was an armed struggle over decades, but that armed struggle was necessary and led to an absolute necessity to negotiate and talk and understand. And all of those people in English prisons were key to that process. It wasn't choice. They had to be consulted. They had to agree. They had to approve. And that's the recipe that we have to learn, and that we should learn, that you taught us. These are very bleak times. The world isn't a better place in any way. We collude with appalling regimes all over the world. We're complicit in torture. We're complicit in rendition. We can't see when there's a fight for self-determination or self-defense. We support the oppressive regime. But in all of this, it's extremely interesting to see that Republicans go here and there in the world today to talk about conflict resolution, how to do it. And so, just to have had you unjustly, wrongly, disgracefully in our prisons has ironically been an extraordinary education for our country, which it didn't deserve. And maybe it hasn't learned the lessons properly. But everything you did that is being marked in this book is important, not just for history. It isn't just the recent history, the history of the recent past. It's in that jail tonight, the far past, and the recent past, and the present, and the future. And so, just once again, it's a most extraordinary honour, and to congratulate everybody who has produced this first instalment, and to say, yes, you've got to get it finished. It's the most important record that I could think of commitment to a struggle that was taken in to the prisons as an absolutely integral part of that struggle and holds its own value. It isn't just the struggle outside, it was the struggle inside, and all that it took to get through that, all that it caused, the damage and the pain to the people inside and their families outside. But it all has to be marked in our history as a struggle of utter importance and integrity for which we're all in your debt.
Thanks, Garrett. That's the end of the speaking for tonight. The book is available